Head honcho of the New Zealand Players Association is good old mate Rob Nicol, who joins us. Welcome back, mate.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Look, when we're faced, constantly with the news of players getting big money offers from Japan, we know that there's a number of All Blacks off at the end of the World Cup. Mwanga, Smith, Bowden Barrett may come back, but a lot of these players are going for good. And then we got Rico Gear, who's got a big money offer on the table as well, which changes everything about it because he's actually a guy that has got years to play in the All Blacks. I suppose what I really want to talk to you about is a couple of things. The fear that, so many of our players are targeted. How can you stop the player drain? Is it just inevitable? And are we going to see, Rob, I know I've got a lot of questions, but we'll talk all through them. Are we going to see this, the time when New Zealand rugby gets to the stage that All Black jersey and playing for the All Blacks isn't going to be enough, and we're going to have to start opening the door and saying, okay, we can select you if you play overseas. So yeah, how much of a worry is it? And how many players are actually being targeted at the moment?
Well, it's something, to be honest, that we've only ever known, and it's a good thing, right? Imagine if our players weren't being targeted. You'd be going, oh, what's going wrong?
Yeah, right.
Like rugby, professional rugby is global, and it's a global marketplace. And I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of the fact that we are, a country surrounded by water. Australia is our biggest neighbour, but in terms of professional rugby, we are operating in what is a global sport now. And throughout the UK, Europe, and into Japan, and now into the United States, there is demand for coaching talent, there's demand for playing talent, and there's demand for commercial partners, and there's a whole lot of fans that want to engage with the game. So that's the world we live in. It's been like it since I can remember, which goes back to when we first went professional. And even before professionalism, Māori, our players were in demand because we produce talented players and talented coaches for that matter. So it's never going to go away, right? So it's not something you're going to beat, and frankly, you don't want to. We want people globally to acknowledge and always recognise that we produce really good rugby players, both male and female, and we produce really good coaches and thought leaders in the game. So actually, let's be comfortable about it and let's agree that it's a good thing. But the other side of it is we have to be able to deal with it in a way that is in the best interest of rugby in this country and what we stand for, and keeping rugby in the place that it holds within New Zealand. So that part is challenging.
Is this player drain at a level that is that unprecedented that you haven't seen before, or is it just really good headline making from the mainstream media and the rest of us?
It's always evolving, and when I say it's always evolving, we actually have way more players than we've ever had before as well. And around the world, particularly in the States at the moment, for a certain group of players, there's quite an opportunity. But it's probably not any more alarming than it was in recent, sort of decade or so. And just, I'll give you a little bit of a picture of what we're feeling at the moment. We're heading into a Rugby World Cup, and a lot of players target their careers of wanting to reach the pinnacle of that World Cup and then looking at options beyond it. So this is not unusual in a Rugby World Cup year to go through a situation where a lot of our top line players are receiving offers, and indeed a number of them are making the decision to move on, either through retirement or heading overseas to play. So that's not unusual. And in particular, it's often for a player in a certain position from a certain market. So the Japanese market's after a certain player, the French market. At the same time, I went and looked at the English Premiership last weekend, and I went through the team list, and there's not a lot of New Zealanders playing. And in fact, we're having a few players come back. You've seen Brad Shields and a number of others come back for Super and for NPC. And so in some positions, the market's actually tightening up overseas, which is really interesting. Another aspect that we're dealing with, and this is, in all honesty, where we sit at the moment, probably more of a concern, is the real value in a lot of the teams sometimes are those players that have played 5 or 6 years of good NPC rugby. And, some of them may have made Super Rugby for a year or 2 years, but just can't quite crack it consistently. But they're in New Zealand, they're playing good NPC, they've got a great link with their communities. They might be, when they're not playing professional rugby, for that 3 months of NPC, they're working, or they would be a tradie or accountant or police person or whatever, they're working in that kind of space.
Yeah.
But where they have absolute gold is when you have an injury or you need to call someone into the Super Rugby level. Absolutely invaluable. Now, in the last 2 or 3 years, the United States with the MLR have kind of popped up, and now we've got sort of 40 or 50 odd players going to that. So they'll go over to the MLR, play in that competition, and the vast majority will come back and play NPC, which is great. But not having them here and available for Super Rugby in terms of depth of replacement players is definitely a challenge that
well,
we're
you
trying
can
to get
actually
our heads
see
around.
that, and look, and we can see that especially with a side like the Highlanders, who when they played the Force in Invercargill, they got guys on the bench who hadn't played any senior rep rugby like that, and so that's where I think the rest of us, the fans, are really noticing it.
Yeah, and what it does mean is that it's a challenge for the coaches, because if you are hit with injuries or a need for replacement players, and you're looking at your stocks, and there'll be a lot of communication during NPC lining up those players, so they'll go out and they'll talk to the players that are not in the initial contract at 38 and say, look, we'd love you to come in pre-Christmas to play the role of the replacement player and do pre-season with us and be available for us if we need you during the season. But all of a sudden they're looking in there, and some of these guys are going overseas, and so they go to the younger crop and they bring them in. And in some respects, it's quite good for the younger players if it works around their study and work, to come in and get some exposure and do some training alongside the Super Rugby teams. But then, of course, you've got that horrible pressure of, is it the right time for that player to be playing Super Rugby, or in an ideal world, are they a couple of years away from playing Super Rugby? And so our depth gets tested. And you're seeing a little bit of that at the moment. There's always those players where you think actually playing another year of under 20s and NPC would possibly benefit them in their career. And I know the coaches, it's a constant tension and conversation they're having with themselves and with the S&C people about not wanting to progress players too quickly. But at the same time, when your depth gets tested, sometimes the temptation is there to do it. So that's probably the area, to be perfectly frank, that we're finding more challenging than normal.
In terms of the player drain, in terms of our All Blacks, and in terms of let's look at Rico as a special case, because he to me could be a precedent setter, and that if you believe what you read, that he's been offered a heck of a lot more money to go to Japan. Now, here's a guy that is, he's not, no one's cementing the All Blacks, Rob, but of course, he is one of the first choice players, and he has got years ahead of him in his career. He gets offered a huge amount of money to go over there, and that would mean giving up that All Black jersey. How close are we to the stage, do you think, where this is a real worry, where all of a sudden New Zealand Rugby might have to start rethinking its policy around, can players be selected from overseas, or is it still, we haven't got a floodgate, we're still finger in the dike on this? Okay, so
there's a bit to cover in that. So
yep.
A couple of things to think about. If you're an individual player and you've got yourself to the top of the game and you're in demand, will you likely get an offer from overseas that could pay you more money than staying in New Zealand? And the short answer is yes. More often than not, you will. I mean, there's a lot of clubs around the world all wanting the very best talent. And some players will choose to take a decision to go. I think of some wonderful players like Charles Piutau, Stephen Lautua, and others that have gone quite early in their careers. And potentially they had long careers ahead of them in the black jersey and at Super Rugby level and the likes. And so what are the kind of things that players should be thinking about? And there's a number of them. Yes, there is some financial opportunity. Will that financial opportunity disappear? For someone like Rico, it won't disappear in the short term. It'll probably still be there in another 4 years' time. But he has been around for a while now, and he will be thinking about himself, as all players do. And the players think about their families and their futures, and they have to go through these processes. So there's no use panicking when these players get offers, because they are going to get offers. And Sam Whitelock, those guys, they've all throughout their career have received offers at key junctures. But once you leave and you are no longer playing on the international stage, that's a big step. And it's a big step in a number of ways. One is the international stage, best versus best. It's seen to be the pinnacle, the opportunity to compete at a World Cup. All those things mean a lot to the players.
Yep.
It means a lot to them in terms of a sense of satisfaction around their career, what they're aspiring to do, their connection back to their communities, wanting to inspire New Zealanders, and all that side of things.
Plus the bright lights, Rob. Let's not forget that. I mean, they're also playing on the biggest stage is a hell of a lot different from playing on the sub stage, isn't it?
That's what, by and large, that's what the players want. Every competitive player, male or female, they're aspiring for that. The Olympic stage and sevens, So all that stuff means a lot. The other part that means a lot is relevance. And there's this thing called out of sight, out of mind.
Yep.
And your career as a professional rugby player is going to morph beyond your playing days. It might stay in rugby. It might go outside of rugby. It might go into another industry. And having relevance whilst you are playing professional rugby in New Zealand and keeping that relevance can be something that's very beneficial for you post-career. So you have seen a number of players, and I think of some fantastic guys like a Justin Collins or a Kevin Mialamu or a Rich McCaw, who have played out their career, James Parsons, who have played out their career in New Zealand and have had long careers and have chosen not to go overseas because what they're seeking in terms of the bigger picture is actually here.
Yeah.
And they don't want to disappear and have to come back and pick it all up and start it again. So there's that kind of stuff comes into it as well. And then, of course, we referenced it before, but you've got family, you've got this innate thing in New Zealanders of a desire to travel and connect and explore different cultures and languages and things. So they all come to it as well. So, once again, don't be surprised when the top players get offered. They will always consider those kind of offers because that's what any human's going to be. As to when they choose to make that move to go overseas, particularly the top players, there's a lot of things that impact that decision. And we're always going to have our top players going through that process. In terms of your final question around when is the right time, if ever there's a right time to say that we pick All Blacks from overseas, we go out and test this with the players a lot. And the strong feedback that we're consistently getting, and we're still getting, is that the moment we open that door, you're not going to be able to close it. And then we're going to be dealing with an unprecedented challenge in terms of keeping professional rugby in this part of the world. Because ultimately, the lure of being able to play on the biggest stage and play in the black jersey, whether it's, like I said, for the Sevens teams or for the Black Ferns or for the All Blacks, and the fact that you have to be here and part of the rugby fraternity and the professional rugby fraternity, playing your footy in New Zealand and keeping professional rugby in this part of the world, therefore keeping the pathway for the kids in this part of the world and everything that goes with it, is really important. The moment you tell everyone that actually your pathway to the All Blacks can be fulfilled through France or England or Japan, then you, and if I can quickly flip across to football or a lot of the other sports, basketball, who, regardless of what they wanted, that's just the way that sport evolved. And what you end up with is you don't really have a professional league in New Zealand. So you got to be incredibly careful about what you wish for if you want to open that door. And that's the thing that normally drives where it lands, which is actually it's a much bigger picture than just being able to select the players who are playing overseas the All Black jersey. It has ramifications right throughout the system, right down to the grassroots and community level game. And kids choosing to play this game and playing for the right reasons because of all the good stuff it does for you and your character and all that side of it. And for those that are wanting to become athletes and go to the top and aspire to be the top, we want them to be able to do that from New Zealand as opposed to leaving at 16 or 17 years of age and heading overseas. So a fair bit to think about.
Yeah. And the counter-argument, though, Rob Nicol from the Players Association with us, is that South Africa have done it and they succeeded and they won a World Cup. So they're actually prepared to do this. Also, I think most of the Six Nations side, they have a caveat that you've got to play a certain amount of tests, don't you? And then you can do it. Do you think it might even soften to that level? And the other sub part of that is, do you have a lot of discussions, or you do still have discussions around New Zealand rugby about maybe our players playing for some of the other Super Rugby franchise sides that aren't in New Zealand, but they're still playing Super Rugby? Do those still come up?
Yeah. Okay. So come back to that. The starting point of that conversation was
South Africa, and their players,
Yeah, South Africa, but is success winning the World Cup? Yes, we want to win and achieve podiums, 100%. But successful rugby in New Zealand is not just about winning on the elite international stage. It's about rugby remaining relevant to our communities and in our schools and playing a role in terms of, and it's just sport in general, the role that sport plays in young people and how they grow up, how it brings people together and it unites, inspires. And regardless of which sport it is, that's what you want. And that ultimately, if that's what success means for rugby in New Zealand, then you can't just measure it by did we win a World Cup. The other part I'd add to it, Marty, and we often do this exercise when we go back and we see key events, whether it's an Olympic Sevens or it's a Black Ferns World Cup last year or a Rugby World Cup this year for the men. If we actually open the doors right now, today, you and I open the doors, how many players would we choose from overseas vis-a-vis the players that are playing in New Zealand? And it's not often that you would get above 2 or 3 that would come into serious consideration. And that's something to remember. We've actually been successful with this in the past, and we're still successful. Like I would argue that the players are available to the All Black management group to select for this year for the World Cup we're incredibly impressed with the pool of talent they've got to select from. And there may be one or two overseas that you would like, oh, well, if they were in the mix and playing well, you'd want to give them serious consideration. But by and large, we're in pretty good space. So that's something else to think about. Another one, which is a classic All Black thing or Black Ferns thing, is just because they do it doesn't mean we do. We do it the way Rugby in New Zealand does it. We do it differently to other people, and we want to be different. Because if we just do what they do, we end up in the same situation as them. And I don't know that South Africa are that happy about the fact that the vast majority of their professional players globally play overseas now, and a lot of the young South African rugby players see their pathway as being fulfilled through Europe and the UK in particular, as opposed to necessarily coming through in South Africa. And that's not what the situation we want to get in. Australia, South Africa, different situation. Argentina don't have a domestic.
No, they don't. No, that's right.
They have to select from overseas, and they have to use other people's competitions. Samoa, Tonga, Fiji in the same boat. So that, that's some relevance around that. Coming back to your Super Rugby thing,
yep.
I'm glad you brought that one up, because to be honest, if we felt there was ever to be a step to be made, our logic was that you wouldn't say, well, you can play overseas as such. What you would say, and it would be the first step that you might think, as long as you're playing in a competition that we're a part of or that we're a part owner of, being Rugby in New Zealand, i.e. Super Rugby,
yep.
Or Opiki when it expands to hopefully include Australia or the Pacific Islands one day. As long as you're playing in a competition we're a part of, and that New Zealand teams are a part of, and New Zealanders are watching and being inspired by, maybe that might be a step you could take one day. But right now it's felt that that's not quite right. But it's something that gets debated and talked about, and it's a good discussion to have.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact on is we have brought innovation and the terminology of sabbaticals. Those sabbaticals, by and large, have been used, and they've been used sparingly. Like they're not available to everyone. You have to earn the right as such, and it's important that threshold's kept high. But it has helped. Absolutely, it's helped. And you've seen the way Damien McKenzie's playing this year, having just returned from a stint in Japan. And I think those kind of tools will continue to be used. Yeah.
One final question, and just quickly, and I thank you so much for your time, mate. I mean, God, we could talk for an hour on this, but one final thing is, I know you represent the players. Have you ever, or do you ever extend that to the coaches and that whole thing about keeping that kind of acumen, that kind of knowledge, that kind of experience? Because, you mentioned right at the start that, the players and the coaches are in such demand overseas. Is there anybody that represents them, or do you sort of inch over in that direction at all?
Oh, we could talk for an hour about this. So we've got some really interesting... So we have at various times linked in with coaches, not just rugby coaches, but coaches across the sports system in New Zealand, because, it sort of strikes us from a player's perspective that the way in which coaches connect and develop, they can do together, working together, they could do such a good job at helping each other. And I'm not just talking about the elite coaches, I'm talking about the sports directors and schools. Yep. So that connection and alignment, bringing in things around the holistic nature and how you have a caring and professional environment that has that performance culture that's appropriate for people first and foremost, and looks after people, but also allows them to be their best in their chosen areas and stuff. So we think there's real value in coaches getting together, and obviously, from a representation point of view, the input they have is massively material and is fantastic. And then from a personal development, coach development perspective, could be incredibly powerful. So we actually think it's an asset for the game that's untapped.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
So we have tried to encourage it, and I think we would be a better game for having the coaches organised and engaged and really helping to drive their own development program and own development system. But I see we go to Shape of the Game forums, at an international level, maybe Conrad Smith and some of our other key people will be in the room, and they get huge value by having the coaches in the room. You put the players and the coaches and the referees in a room together, and the quality of the conversation around what needs to happen with the game is incredible. And normally, if you actually left it to that group, I think we'd get some pretty...
Yeah, I was just going to say, we'd probably solve a lot of stuff, wouldn't we? Yeah, that's the case, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So I guess you know where I'm coming from. But I think there's another one to think about. So years ago, coaches would come from the thought leaders amongst players, or those that had the skill set of teaching, or were teachers or passionate about coaching, right? Now, as rugby's become professional in New Zealand, players have gone overseas at the end of their career, And luckily for us, have returned back to New Zealand, and we've ended up with players becoming coaches off the back of that. Scott Robinson, Leon McDonald, those guys are all examples that have had a period of time overseas. They've come back and they've coached in New Zealand. We're now in a situation where we have 450 or 460 of our current player members playing professionally overseas.
Wow.
At the moment, we've got more full-time rugby players overseas than we do have in New Zealand, just to give people a feel for it.
Who knew that? Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's a lot, right? And so you look at that and then you think that's where a lot of the thought leaders in the game are. And a lot of those people are going to want to become coaches. But what we're starting to notice is a lot of them are finishing playing and staying overseas and coaching. So I could, right now, list off so many coaches that are coaching over in UK, Europe, even in the States at the moment. We've had young coaches from a couple that were involved in OPICI last year. The MPC last year have gone over to coach in the States with the MLR. But, the John Gibbses of the world, those guys that went overseas, Jerome Kainos of the world, they've been involved in academy programs and coaching professional teams overseas. Actually, one of our challenges is how do we get our thought leaders back from overseas now? We're going to have to provide pathways for young coaches who are talking about not just coming back to coach a couple months MPC. What they need to be thinking about is, I want to come back, but they'll be coming back with a small family. So they want to come back and be able to live in one place. They want the family to be able to, the kids to be able to go to school, the family to be able to settle down, and they want to have a meaningful coach development pathway for themselves. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges, in my view, from a professional rugby sense, that we actually face in the next decade, is how do we get our thought leaders back and back into the system in New Zealand, thought leaders who are in high demand overseas, are getting offered jobs to stay overseas and have young families. So there goes another little challenge for you. There's probably another chat for another day.
Yeah, a chat for another. Look, honestly, I've kept you on the phone way too long, mate. Thank you so much for this. And let's reconvene on this. I might have just given you another job there and another little string to your bow there. I just want to finally end on you yourself. And I always love it when I see your name, that you're doing these nutcase races with Rich, and you're down down mountains and through lakes, and God knows. Are you still doing that? Because you didn't do the last one. What happened, bro?
No, we got evac'd on one, so I had a little bit of a problem with the air, but it's good stuff, and I'll always try and do the odd one. But I tell you what I did do, Marty, and this is a big recommendation for anyone. I was lucky enough to do the Coast to Coast this year, and I actually did it with my son, who's 20.
Wow!
So that was pretty special, and Rich did it with another guy, Nathan Cohen, former gold medalist rower, and those boys smoked it. They had a great time out. I think, Nathan certainly enjoyed it, being exposed to that event. But I was lucky enough to do it with my son, and that was a pretty special event. So probably just having a little rest at the moment, as you do when you feel you've earned it, and I'll look out for something else. So watch this space.